for women who've done really well until then and suddenly get hit by this, and they blame themselves and they blame their multitasking and they blame their sick mums and dads and they blame their difficult teenage children and their long-term relationship that's not so good. And they take it all out on themselves and they suffer. And actually, sometimes you just need the hormones. And, that moment where you suddenly get your estrogen and progesterone back, I mean, for me, it was a miracle because I got my memory back.
Kate, it is wonderful to have you back on the show. Super popular last time. You're here today to talk about everything to do with midlife, hormones, brain health, mental health. I'm really excited to have you back. So welcome back.
Thank you for having me on. We've got a lot to cover, haven't we? It's a massive subject.
We have got a lot of ground to cover. And I think that, but you do that so well. And that's one of the things I love about your books, right? Is they're very content dense, but very easy to read. So I'm confident we'll get through this.
I think it's so important to tell women's stories all the time, as well as giving them a science paper and the truth and the accurate truth. And I think we learn from stories of other people and identify with those stories. And that's how our brains really work. And however hard you argue one thing or another, if someone hears it working for their neighbor, their friend, someone on your podcast, then it becomes a different kind of truth, the truth they're more confident in, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you. Absolutely. So I think many women listening to this, because we've talked about it a few times on the show, will be aware that hormone therapy there was a lot of confusion around it, which has now for the most part been disproven. You and I actually were just talking about some very interesting stats that you share in one of your books, Everything You Need to Know About Menopause, about the risks of hormone therapy, like bioidentical hormone therapy reducing risk in comparison to things like obesity, which can really increase risk of breast cancer. And in fact, even in the old forms of hormone therapy that were being used, synthetic hormones previously, that those were not as risky as even having a glass of wine a day, which might be surprising to many people. And obesity seems to come out as the biggest risk factor.
Yeah. It's really interesting. And one of the things that happens in perimenopause is as our estrogen runs out, we're getting rid of the estradiol, which is the really good estrogen, which indeed we give back in HRT. And we've got this other estrogen trying to compensate, and it's called estrone. And guess where we make estrone? In our muffin top, round our middle, in our fat. It comes from adipose tissue, the estrone. And the estrone has been shown in vitro, in test tubes, basically, to increase the growth of breast cancer cells. So it's a bad kind of estrogen. It won't do that in everybody. But the fact that your body is building up this sort of substitute estrogen rather than the one that really, really works is a problem. And that's why we often see women who are overweight or obese. That does increase their breast cancer risk. And alcohol also increases your breast cancer risk. And those two risks are far higher than even taking the old synthetic HRT, which is kind of interesting. And what is really interesting about this to me and for a huge number of doctors and scientists who are working on this together, is that we have been telling women that having their own natural hormone back will kill them or give them breast cancer, which seems a bit wrong when you think about it. You've been doing great until you're like 45 or 50 on these hormones, and suddenly they're serial killers. I don't think so. And the key point is differentiating synthetic hormones and body or bioidentical hormones, which are copies of your own hormones and available on the NHS or FDA regulated in America. And those body identical hormones have a far, far lower risk. And there are these observational studies, and, they are not going to increase your risk of breast cancer as far as we can see. The other things you need to pay more attention to are exercise, nutrition, and weight, and stress reduction. That is all far more important, than worrying about taking a little drip of HRT, your own hormone back. And I think we've got this message so wrong for women. What do you think?
I completely agree with you. And I think that, there might be or there is a small number of women who maybe they discuss it with their doctors and the risks outweigh the benefits for them. But for the most part, and I also find that a lot of the changes that women need to make. So often we need to address changes, right? As you were saying, to our stress, to our lifestyle, to the way that we are exercising. We need to be lifting weights, working on bone density, things like that, as well as
Mm.
muscle mass. Actually, just having hormones will complement all of that and just make it so much easier. And I had a similar conversation with Dr. Sarah Gottfried to say, we're seeing so much dysregulation in women, partly because of the amount of stress that we're now under that we weren't under previously. And
Mm.
so, I asked the question, do you think we can go through this period of our lives without actually needing additional hormones? And her view was, if you did absolutely everything correctly. Do you know what I mean? So if you really were dialing in your sleep properly, you were meditating every day, you were doing exactly the right amount of strength training coupled with the aerobic training, eating tons of plants with the right amount of protein, had all that stress reduction, then maybe, but not many of us live in that world where we can get it so perfectly right on a daily or even weekly basis. And so I think they do complement. And I also think that when you feel better, and you talk about this in your book, that you'll never know what it feels like to take hormone. You can't imagine what it would feel like to have hormone therapy, just like you can't kind of imagine what it's like to give birth or have an orgasm. You can't kind of simulate those experiences. And I think that's the thing, is that when women start to feel better, they're also then more likely to make the changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're more likely to lose weight and, do exercise. And I think one of the things about hormone therapy is it's just such a monster created by the media and by some very old fashioned medics. And in fact, what you should do is feel confident and think, what if I went on it for a month or 2 months? And obviously it takes a while to settle, but what if you said to yourself, I'm going to go on it for 3 months. I'm going to journal every day what I feel. I'm going to keep an eye on my body and what, I weigh and what my breasts feel like and all these things. And then at the end of 3 months, I will decide by myself whether this makes sense for me. And I will have read all the papers and all the latest stuff and not just gone by what one person in one surgery who was educated 40 years ago tells me, because I have a duty to make this choice by myself for my own health, properly informed. And I think that is not what's happening. We're still being treated as children
Mm.
by our doctors quite a lot. I mean, I just get endless Instagram messages from women who have been turned down for HRT by their doctors, and they'll say, "You're too young, 47. You're too old, 55." And it's just not true. If you're getting hot flushes, you've got a hormonal deficiency. If you're very depressed and you've never been depressed in your life before, could it be your hormones? Why not try it for 3 months? And I think we're going to talk later about the mental health
Mm.
question around this, but it's certainly what I've been researching a great deal more, is that, hormones are in your head, is my big conversation now.
Yeah, and I'd love to get into that in a moment. I think it's a shame, given all the awareness that there has been, particularly in the UK over the last 2 to 4 years, that women are still getting that response from their doctor. I wanted to ask you something around whether your research has looked into women also, excuse me, learning to kind of naturally titrate their dose. So
Yeah.
when they're in perimenopause, for example, some women will still have a menstrual cycle, and really how much is being done around that to help women regulate it and actually understand how to use it.
Yeah. Well, of course, this has not been taught in medical schools. For the first time this year, menopause was part of the curriculum.
Right.
Oops. So the business of titrating HRT and prescribing HRT has not been properly taught to this generation of doctors, and it's quite complicated. There are some great 1 hour videos online you can watch from various experts and learn it even as an ordinary person and as a woman. But yes, guess what? All our hormones are different and we all need different amounts at different times. And one of the things I sort of learned afterwards, and I hadn't thought about it in perimenopause, when I was going through perimenopause, I'm aware now that I had huge estrogen highs, which are kind of sexual highs and creative highs and then sudden lows. But my estrogen was really, and lots of women get that as part of the roller coaster. Before the estrogen goes down, it goes up. And then progesterone is going slowly down on a hill. And of course, when you've got those huge estrogen highs, you're building up the lining of your womb. So you're going to have a much, much bigger bleed. And you don't know when it's going to come because the highs aren't organizing themselves once a month. They're
Mm.
just bouncing around whenever they want. So you suddenly get a period, you haven't had a period for a month and a half, and it's a tsunami. And you don't know why. And I didn't understand that. And, 44% of women get big periods. That's a survey of 4,000 diverse women. So we know that is true. And one of the things I thought was, gosh, if I had taken body identical progesterone and kept my progesterone up at a decent level while I was in perimenopause, my late 40s, those periods would not have been so disastrous and debilitating because, I couldn't go in the tube without 2 Tampax, literally it was
Mm.
that. And, women really, really, some of them take time off work, they're miserable. And the idea of adding natural progesterone or indeed a merino coil helps as well, to women at that stage, and then saying, right, your estrogen's going down now, you've had a couple of hot flushes. What about 1 pump a day? Then the hot flushes are still coming. What about 2 pumps a day, which is the kind of regular amount? And then if you don't absorb it through your skin, and we know we all absorb things differently, you put, face cream on and it disappears in 1 second on one woman, and on the other woman, it sits there for a while and then melts gently in, and of course, the estrogen gel with alcohol in it does the same thing. And some women don't absorb it. Some do. Some absorb the patches. Some don't. Do our doctors know enough about that? Have there been enough studies? No, because nobody cares, because you don't make any money out of selling hormones because they're a natural product, and you're not going to go and patent estrogen because it's in our bodies. So that's how complicated it is. And that's why we have to look after ourselves, talk to our friends. And that's why so many people go to private doctors. And that's a privilege. And lots of them know what they're doing because they're dealing with hundreds of menopausal women a week. And they're learning as guinea pigs, as we all are, as we go along, because this isn't known really yet,
No,
is
because
it?
it's not taught. And
Yeah.
it's, I think what's so crazy as well, though, is that this isn't taught in school. Like, I've been really surprised by my children's biology and sex education classes that we seem to teach puberty, and then they get taught the menstrual cycle, and that's it. So you could assume that a woman has a menstrual cycle forever
Yep.
because there's
Granny is
nothing.
down in the corner shop getting her
Yeah,
Tampax, age 92. And
exactly.
why
It's
would
just
you assume
not
otherwise?
taught. So I remember one client I had who worked at a company, and she was trying to raise awareness within the organization, and a guy had said to her within the company, what percentage of women go through menopause?
Oh.
100% of women, actually,
Yeah.
if they were lucky to live that long.
Yeah. I think, though, we feared discussing it, and women didn't shout about it because there was nothing we could do except keep calm and carry on. And we didn't know about the fitness things, the lifestyle things. And my other big subject of the autumn is I'm doing a big study, and I've done lots of research with a charity on osteoporosis, and not explaining about osteoporosis to women over 50, or indeed younger women who have earlier insufficient hormones, is shocking. And so I realized, 1 in 2 women have an osteoporotic break. They have a fracture after 50. Okay, that's everybody. Everybody knows someone who's now going to break their hip, break their knee, fracture their wrist, fall over. And we all know so many older women who've died after hip fractures. They're just part of our firmament, aren't they? And then you look at the studies on estrogen, and I've just looked at some recently, and they show that the depletion of estrogen, when it starts in perimenopause, that's when your bone density starts going down. So in the average woman, your bone density is going down quite heavily in your late 40s, which I hadn't clocked that. I just thought, oh, after menopause, bone density goes down. But oh no, it's around menopause that your bone density goes down between 10 and 20%.
Which is huge.
And then that's when you hit osteopenia, which just means, you've got low bone density, and then osteoporosis, which means you're constantly at risk of fracture and it gets worse. And I just got some scans sent to me by a doctor today of one of her patients. And it was a DEXA scan before and after HRT, about a year and a half apart. And at the beginning, we see her spinal bone density, and they're taking it from 0. And then at the end, after taking HRT, her bone density's gone up by 8% in a
8.
year. 8. And that's not abnormal. There are science papers to show that. But it was just extraordinary to see it on a graph, this line shooting up of this woman's bone density once she got her hormones back. And of course, bones work on hormones, and hormones affect bones turnover, and bones, we're like trees. These are our branches. We have to feed them. They come and go, that they regenerate all the time. And that women, school children, aren't taught that our bones are living, growing things, and we get a picture of the skeleton in the corner of the kind of biology classroom dangling just the bones, and nobody kind of explains bones are held up by muscle, bones are living things, bones are fed by hormones. And the ignorance is just shocking, and that's sort of one of the things I'm campaigning on. And you must, because you do lots on muscle work and things, you must have sort of great solutions for helping people to avoid osteoporosis beyond the HRT. Do you not?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always, always banging on about it, right, on social media and just sharing things and showing. And I think women still, though, have that fear, right? If I start training my muscles, am I going to get too big? I mean, you're fighting against the law of entropy. Like, it's going. Do you know what I mean? We know that if we don't exercise, we're losing 3 to 8% of our muscle mass per decade.
Yeah.
But it's not just about muscle mass, right? As you say, it's about the bone density, and it's also about strength. Sorry, my dog let herself in, so then there was noise. Sorry.
My dog's here.
Yeah, it's about the strength as well, and then having that time under tension, which is enhancing bone density and bone health. But the other thing that surprises me is that we're not taught this either. Parents are unaware of how important it is to actually lay down good bone density through puberty, right? Because that's when you can actually accumulate most of that and protect yourself later. And no one seems to know about that. So we're sort of starting it at the end anyway, trying to solve a problem, but not looking at the beginning and going, well, how do we educate people? Just a bit of PE may or may not be the thing to cut it. And I think increasingly teenagers start to opt out of sport, which is a shame as well, particularly when you get 16 plus, right? And you go into A levels in the UK. There's not as much sport. And so if those teenagers are then not someone who, for example, goes to the gym, it's great if they go swimming, but you're suspended, right, in water. You're not going to see big improvements in bone density. So I just think there needs to be education at both ends for people to really, really understand it.
I think you're so right. And also telling people about protein very early on. And you think of all those girls who are carefully not eating this and not eating sugar and being vegan and not sort of eating, proper beans and nuts and just eating a tomato pizza, and it's kind of so important that we understand about protein and muscles. And there are all these sort of feminine things, aren't they? Protein and muscles and testosterone, and they all really, really matter to women. And it's partly that bias of almost language and tradition that we're fighting. It's not, it's a huge thing. And I always think when I'm eating, and I was bulimic at school and things like that. Lots, who didn't have an eating problem at school, basically. But when I eat now, and I haven't had any problem with that for years, but I think, will this make me strong? And on the whole, that means I'll go and have a big bag of nuts, without salt, or I'll go and have a load of chicken or whatever, and a load of vegetables or whatever. But, I'll look at a cake and go, that probably won't make me strong, the lemon cake. I'll have the other thing. But if I'm hungry, I'll go and eat it, and you don't, thinking that way, you satisfy yourself, but you don't tend to sort of put on lots of weight or anything if you think, will this make me strong? And that's, and the other thing I was listening to, this fantastic woman called Dr. Vonda Wright, who you probably know of in America, who's written a paper on the musculoskeletal syndrome of the menopause. She's absolutely superb about muscles and bones and what's happening with all that. But one of the things she says about food is, get your protein. But the other thing she says is sugar bakes you from the inside, which I think is a great thing to remember, even though it's not quite true. Do you know what I mean? It is doing something bad inside you. And obviously we do like a piece of cake occasionally, but it's just getting young women to understand that everything you see on a shop shelf in a little corner store is crap. And, you've got to be strong and look after your bones. And it's just so hard, I think.
It is hard. And I think what is lovely to see is, I think, through some of the social media, is this developing narrative that strong women, strong over skinny,
Yeah.
and I'm really in favor of that, because I think that will help to protect against eating disorders. Before we move into kind of the mental health aspect of things,
Mhm.
what about the sort of greenwashing that we're
Oh,
seeing a little bit? I don't like this, menopause chocolate. I don't think I need, I'm quite happy just eating chocolate. I don't need menopause chocolate, that's got different adaptogens, which are probably absolutely tiny amounts. But I feel like this is women being taken advantage of, in
yeah.
all honesty.
Yeah. Because there's an industrial complex, a capitalist complex making money out of it. And the capitalist complex is not going to make money really out of HRT on a big scale. So giving people their natural hormones back, lose in terms of kind of profit. Selling people tiny potions made incredibly cheaply for £30 a month or £50 a month, absolutely fantastic. Playing on women's fears of the unnatural and playing on their ignorance and the lack of science and the lack of education. Brilliant. So everybody's making profit. And I did investigate the Holland and Barrett menopause chocolate with almonds. And I looked into the ingredient. I can't remember what the added ingredient was, but I looked into the science papers on it. And I worked out the amount in the chocolate was so tiny that if you wanted to have a slight mood lift, which is what they were claiming, and it was only a survey of about 30 people anyway, you had to eat 2 bars of chocolate every day. So
And then how
basically,
much sugar are
you
you
were
having?
just spooning up spoonfuls of sugar, and that was going to help your menopause. And I mean, literally, that's just unbelievably wrong, isn't it? And really, really daft. And of course, most women are not that stupid, but they'll be at the till and they'll say, "Oh, I'll have some menopause chocolate," and then they'll eat a bar of chocolate, thinking it's good. It's just horrible. And the other thing that's happening is all the supermarkets like Tesco's and Morrison's have got something called the M tick on their shelves. And these are menopause approved products. And these products have to pay money to a corporation to get the M tick. And of course, they're Nivea and Colgate. And exactly how will that particular toothpaste help with your menopausal teeth,
Mm.
which are dying from bone density anyway? And, how is the Nivea cream going to be any better than the ordinary Nivea cream that everybody buys anyway for a couple of quid, So there's that kind of thing, which is just
And is it
using
even got hormone disruptors, right? If you actually look it up on Think Dirty, it probably it probably isn't a clean product and has a whole
it's
load of
just
hormone disruptors in it.
And the idea that big tenor pants, okay, buy your big incontinence pants in black for menopause, great. There are some people who do have problems, who do have leakage. But on the whole, people who get leakage around menopause and perimenopause, it's because the collagen has gone in their vulva and vagina. And what they need is to top up early as possible with vaginal estrogen, which will bring all that elasticity back. They need to do pelvic floor exercises, and they maybe need to take, lactobacillus probiotic supplements, which also help the happy bacteria grow in your urethra and around your vagina. And so they could be doing those three things, but yet they're buying big nappies for women. And it makes me unbelievably angry. Even if 10% of those women didn't have to go in there, buy those and humiliate themselves. And they could be perfectly all right if someone had told them, your hormones are missing permanently from your vagina and vulva. They're never going to come back. You can safely put cream on or a pessary. It will not give you breast cancer. And that's absolutely proven. And you can use it after breast cancer too. And it's basically like putting face cream on down there. And it makes an incredible difference to UTIs as well. And
Yeah.
I mean, literally, this
Right.
is politics, isn't it? It's politics and capital. We're not just sitting here doing a women's health podcast. Do you know what I mean? It really, really matters to millions of women not being informed of that. And you think about all the older women, your grannies and your mums in care homes, all suffering from urinary tract infections and problems. What if we went in there with a little bit of cream,
Mm.
cheap? I mean, it really upsets me actually.
It does. No, it really upsets me as well. And I think there's just so much misinformation. And I think there was a time you know, like when you were doing the documentary and thing, there's a lot of raised awareness. But actually now, apart from what's on social media, which you can't always trust, right? It's sort of gone a bit quiet again, and we've had all these products develop. So there's
Mm.
like awareness, and now these companies seem to have taken advantage of it and are making a lot of money, but we're not having the same education. What about mental health? You and I were speaking about this, and as someone who, you know, I've suffered obviously with mental health postpartum and then afterwards. I've definitely found that it's been a bit more of a challenge going through perimenopause.
Yeah.
And you and I spoke about that offline last time.
Mm.
What have you been finding there in your research?
Yeah. Well, interestingly, if you're someone like you that had postpartum, depression, postnatal depression, you are, of course, more likely to deal with the hormonal problems of perimenopause worse because you're very influenced by the fluctuations. And, it's same with the people that have PMDD. They often have, the problems continue on because you are hormone sensitive humans. And so are a lot of people. But what I've been sort of studying, and I suddenly had a kind of vision that made sense of talking about mental health around menopause, because we do know, that I think 69% of women in one of the surveys reported anxiety, depression, low mood. People are just sleepless. About 84% of people are sleepless. And that causes massive mental health repercussions, even though
Mm,
it's only a small thing and it doesn't seem to be. It really, really, affects women. And brain fog at about 73%. That also makes people lose confidence. So you've got these triple whammies of not sleeping, losing confidence. And then I was looking at the brain, and the films Inside Out, where
yeah.
the little hormones in the girls' brains, and there's anger and disgust and jealousy, and I can't remember, but there's four little cartoon characters in her brain. I was thinking, let's think about our brains at say 50 or 51, when our periods have pretty well gone. And you've got estrogen, joyful creative estrogen. You've got progesterone, calming, helping you sleep, help stopping you from being angry. You've got testosterone, mighty but dwindling. And then, estrogen and progesterone fight, grow bigger and larger in your brain. They fight, and then they leave your brain forever. And all the little estrogen and testosterone receptors that are sitting around in your brain like little cups waiting for estrogen to get put into them are sitting there empty. And instead, you've got cortisol storming around. You've got the remains of testosterone. You've got a tiny bit of oxytocin. You've got a couple of other hormones like estrone, we were talking about, the not good hormone that has more risks. And you just think about that brain with two of the characters have left.
Mm,
No wonder we feel odd. I think
mm,
I think that's, and no
exactly.
wonder we get depression, because of course estrogen, helps with serotonin, and and dopamine and all these things. Those feel good neurotransmitters in
And
our brain.
anxiety too, right? A lot
So,
of women
and
struggle with
progesterone, when
anxiety.
it leaves, that's the anxiety. The anxiety ramps as the progesterone goes down. And when you look at it, in cartoon form, you can see it kind of clearly. And you can see the sort of battles between having too much of one hormone and too little of another. And then you think, well, there's all these estrogen receptors sitting there. And more grow because they're so desperate for what little bit of estrogen is left. And they're all sort of sitting there starving. And then you give them back hormone replacement therapy. And that can make just such a huge difference to mental health. But I mean, what we found, and I'm doing a presentation to the Royal College of Psychiatrists on World Menopause Day about, the sort of women's point of view of what's going on in your head and what we know. And it's just really interesting to realize that bipolar disorder has this kind of rocketing up process in perimenopause, particularly when things are unstable. Depression grows in perimenopause. Obviously we know that the suicide rate rises as well, not as much as men's, but it does. And there's that general kind of malaise of 1 in 10 women leaving their job and not feeling confident. And there's just as though we're sort of muffled and squashed and given antidepressants. And really, for women who've done really well until then, and suddenly get hit by this, and they blame themselves, and they blame their multitasking, and they blame their sick mums and dads, and they blame their difficult teenage children and their long-term relationship that's not so good. And they take it all out on themselves and they suffer. And actually, sometimes you just need the hormones. And, that moment where you suddenly get your estrogen and progesterone back, I mean, for me, it was a miracle because I got my memory back. And literally, I had been struggling to write a shopping list, write down the word, I wrote down the word shaver. And then 15 minutes later, I thought, another word for that. I think it's razor. And, you forget a noun, right? Or you forget which side of the street you should be driving on. And that just makes you terrified because you think, oh, I've got Alzheimer's. And that terror also doesn't help because it's just women's lack of knowledge. So I think to understand that hormones are not about the ovaries. And the man who named menopause, French guy, last 2 centuries ago, basically, worked out that menses stop menopause, it stops. And of course, we were just seen as vessels for reproduction. So why did anything else matter? Who gave a damn about what happened in our brains? We had stopped bleeding, therefore we'd stop being fertile, therefore you might as well throw us in the bin. And, we weren't going to spend any time thinking about what those hormones or the lack of them were doing in our heads. And, this is really interesting, a massive feminist issue within science, really, a gender bias within science, that we
Huge.
need to think that the hormones were not just in our ovaries, but they're in every cell in our bodies. And
Yeah,
who
I
says
mean, the
it's
benefits for
rubbish?
cardiovascular health as well, right? The
Yeah,
benefits to cardiovascular are huge. Yeah,
it
no, I
is
agree.
it is a massive sort of dupe, and we are sort of tearing the veil off people's eyes and trying to explain, you know, what's going on. And part of that massive dupe around menopause is testosterone, and for younger women as well on the pill, their testosterone gets lowered by some pills, and they don't want to have sex so often, which would be the point of going on the pill, and but testosterone, cardinal female hormone, we make a huge amount, even more than estrogen, around our early 20s, and it goes down very, very gently. So, yeah, some people in menopause are still riding on their testosterone, and that's great. And also, testosterone can also turn into estrogen in the body. It's quite adaptable, it's quite a similar
Mm.
hormone.
Through the
And
aromatase pathway.
and then, we have people in their 70s who've still got a tiny bit left, but we know it goes right down to your 60s. And then some people do a wee bit better, but most people don't. And that's not counted as a female hormone. We're not allowed to say we need it. And, we're only allowed presently on the NHS to get back our testosterone for libido. And that's what the menopause societies say too. They have previously said other things, but at the moment, their guidance is you can only have your testosterone back if we've checked everything else and your libido is down and we've had a little chat with you about your relationship. And,
And that's the
does that
only
happen
time
when
they'll
you're going
prescribe
for
it.
Viagra? I mean, it's just bonkers. So,
It's
yeah,
crazy.
but the testosterone, just fascinating. New study out in one of the women's mental health journals, which is an observational study of 500 women looking at their mood. And half of them, were saying, my mood is better. And about 40% said, my cognition is better due to the testosterone added to their HRT. And just think, well, if this makes half of women feel a lot better and maybe more, it's just, and it's so good for muscles. And of course we know that it's
Mm.
good for muscles and bones in men. What's it been doing in women all this time? Just partying, waiting for them to have libidos? I mean, what do we think that hormone's been doing? Why would we make it if it was only for one thing? Why would we have
And also
testosterone
like
receptors?
motivation and drive. And I mean, it affects the economy, right? Because you're going to have women who have greater productivity and motivation. And as you say, they can hold things in their head much better. I think
Mm,
one thing I have noticed aside from hormones is creatine. I've tested this with quite a few people and just cycled on and off it. But creatine, in terms of optimizing that brain function and
that's it.
reducing brain fog, yes, it's great to complement your training in terms of your strength that
Mhm.
you're doing, but also that power, those fast twitch muscle fibers, and really
Mm,
helping to support that, which we know those fast twitch muscle fibers degrade much faster, right, than our slow
right.
twitch. But
Right.
creatine also is just incredible for brain health, for neurological health. And it's one of the like cheapest and most studied supplements. And I find with women, particularly smaller women, just 2.5 to 3 grams of
Mm.
creatine on a daily basis. It helps to, there's also research with creatine that it compensates for a poor night of sleep. So,
Mm.
if you're not sleeping well and you just get much better function, that I'm a big fan of. I also think more education, around some of the work I do when I go into companies and things is how do you actually optimize your fitness so that you feel better
Mm.
beyond like muscle mass and strength and bone density? Because even like large exercises, for example, so like ones where you do squats or push-ups, and you're doing those compound lifts help to increase BDNF in the brain. And that helps to support your brain
Oh,
health,
yeah.
right? That's like miracle grow. And I think if women started to understand, because it's like if you've had a poor night's sleep, which you do sometimes, and that can be because of children, it can be for a variety of reasons. And more women obviously have younger children now in their 40s than before. So they may still be having disrupted sleep at the same time as perimenopause. And then you think, well, should I exercise? Actually, yes, it like helps to compensate for some of
Mm.
that. And that in combination with things like creatine. So I just, I'm as
Is that
passionate as
your
you are, Kate, on just
is that
helping.
your main tip in terms of, because you've done a lot of investigating around this in terms of brain health? Because we were talking about lion's mane earlier, and what do you
Yeah.
think? I mean, given, let's say, someone doesn't want to take HRT and they've got some reason that they can't, what would you think in terms of brain health?
In terms of brain health,
Top
so
stuff,
there's a few
apart from
things.
nutrition and exercise, which are your top supplements.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. So always like, yeah, definitely dialing in that nutrition and exercise. And I think as part of, and the sleep, as part of nutrition, I would always encourage people to increase their protein, not just because of muscle mass, but also because of just having those essential amino acids available. They're used for the building blocks of everything, right?
Mhm.
Including your neurotransmitters. And you'll have better satiety signals. So now you're not craving the sugary foods, which actually can make you feel lethargic and compound things like that, brain fog. So I think making sure you have really good levels of protein.
Mm.
Beyond that, in terms of sleep, like a lot of women, let's say they're not taking hormone therapy and they're struggling with sleep, then I think that breathwork practices like micro recoveries through the day are
Mm.
very important. And we've seen that when we look at our data on heart rate variability. So
Mm.
we'll monitor someone for 3 or 5 days and just look at what's happening all day and night and how is the day informing the
Mm.
night. And what we see
Yeah.
is that when women are highly stressed and in that sympathetic state all day, that gets mirrored over at night. So now they don't relax. But I
Mm.
think some of the supplements like L-theanine, for example, in combination with phosphatidylserine can work very well, or
I don't
someone
even
taking some
understand what you're
GABA.
saying, but
So some of those things. So like L-theanine, for example, is an amino acid that's found in green tea. And
okay.
Buddhist monks obviously get that caffeine mixed with
Mm.
L-theanine and they can be alert, but in that meditative state. And
Oh,
so
okay.
things like phosphatidylserine can help to lower stress and
Mm.
lower that cortisol. Because some
Mm.
women, what you see is they've just got a really dysfunctional cortisol rhythm now as well. And so they're
Yeah.
waking up very early because cortisol's peaking,
Mm.
or sometimes it's, very early, or it's not actually really getting off the ground in the morning. And then they need something more to sort of boost them up in the morning. But
Yeah.
I think looking at it like that and just thinking, do I need extra support around my nutrition, my fitness and my sleep to
Mm.
dial things in further so that
Yeah.
I can feel, really, really good. And there's a lot of things you can do and that work alongside hormone therapy as well.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing is the expense, isn't it? It's just
Mm.
very expensive. And I mean, in terms of studies, in terms of trying to get as many people in the best health possible, particularly with the NHS crashing in Britain and the health system crashing in America and people not being insured and things like that, it is kind of HRT is the cheapest, most effective thing that can happen to a female body other than nutrition and exercise. And they've looked at the effects in terms of longevity of giving HRT to middle class women who are doing all the other stuff in the yoga, and giving HRT to people in economically deprived areas who are not necessarily doing all that other stuff around for their health because they don't have time and they don't have the money. And the increase in the number of years they live, women on HRT, it really makes a difference in the economically deprived communities. And it makes a difference to the diseases that people get in terms of cardiovascular disease and diabetes and probably dementia too. And that was a big study in the UK Biobank, and they looked at over 100,000 women. So it's really interesting to think, what's the best way to use what we have for different people? And it's very individual, but it's really worth having that as one of the building blocks. I feel it. I feel very, very strongly. And I've also just been loving the stuff on Alzheimer's and HRT. And of course, HRT not recommended for dementia. But let's just stop for a second and think, well, hold on, that was the old HRT. It was filled with synthetic progestins. Have they studied the new HRT, which is body identical, the same as your own hormone, for 20 years in a randomized group of women, some of whom have got Alzheimer's, some of whom haven't? Well, of course they haven't, because it would cost millions and millions of pounds, and nobody is going to do that survey. But what we do have in America is a study of 400,000 women in one of the huge Kentucky health databases, the private health databases. And they're comparing middle-class women in jobs who can afford healthcare with middle-class women who can afford healthcare, basically. So it's a fairly, homogenous group of women. And those who were on any kind of HRT, even the old slightly crappy kind, had a much lower rate of dementia, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's. Those who were on transdermal HRT, which is the best kind, had around a 70% reduced rate of Alzheimer's compared to the other middle class women. So, if you are me and you are a daughter of Alzheimer's and you watched your mum really, really go downhill for 5 years, I am going to take HRT for the rest of my life. And, you can tell me in 20 years, we might have a randomized controlled trial that someone might have paid for. But that's not fast enough for me. And I am going to go on the observational studies and also the studies of brain biomarkers, which we now have, because that's cheap, right? You can look at, the hormones in the brain, the blood in the brain, what's going on, the amyloid plaques in the brain, which are potentially the precursors to Alzheimer's, basically like plaque building up on your teeth, plaque building up in your brain. And what we see is women who are on estrogen HRT have a much lower buildup of amyloid plaque. And we also know they have lower hot flushes. And those who get very high levels of hot flushes are much more likely to get Alzheimer's and dementia. And not knowing exactly how all this is connected, in a sense, nobody wants to write an official paper on it. But when you put all the official papers together and you are a person who's making that health decision like me, and, 1 in 5 women get Alzheimer's in the UK. So it's very common. What decision would you make, And I'm making that decision in an individual way. And yeah, there could be other risks, but oh my God, I just don't want to go through losing my memory.
No, I mean, I think watching someone with Alzheimer's is just so sad and so difficult for them and for the people around them. And that's, it's super interesting. So where can people find out more, Kate? Because I know you're doing some fun things, right? You are, tell us what's coming up. Have you got another documentary or book? Or?
I've got a couple of documentaries in, but God, it's hard to get funding for some of these things. And, but I'm hoping to do one on hormones. But the thing that I'm writing right now, and I've got to finish by December, is called How to Have a Magnificent Midlife Crisis. So it's about all this chaos that's about to land, but it's about doing it well. And it's not just about longevity or menopause. It's about how your brain changes. It's about how to get elegantly divorced. It's about how to upgrade your relationship with your partner if you have one. It's about sex after 50. And it also includes my very radical psilocybin experience, which may well be a separate podcast. But I tested a very large dose in a very safe space with a group of women and a really great moderator. And I had an amazing experience, which has actually changed my outlook on life. And I was very surprised because I'd been looking at all the psilocybin and depression science, and I'd read all the papers before I went and did it as the guinea pig. And it was, really, really interesting, very, very, very powerful. And, our group of women had quite a radical and tough time, but it was amazing. So I've written about that. I've written a chapter on that too, and not just me doing it, but the science that is now available on psilocybin and depression on mushrooms, on magic mushrooms. So
How
that's all very
exciting.
exciting.
I have to say, you know, I very much believe that I think that transitional phase of our lives as women is the time to embrace new beginnings, right? And it's how the
Yeah.
Japanese speak of it, and I think that's how we should. So I love that. So you're finishing writing it by December. When can we expect to be able to read it?
I think summer 2025, my publisher says, if I
Okay,
get my homework in on time.
summer
She's very
2025.
keen to get it out there, and it's from Simon and Schuster. So we will see. But in a sense, I've had a lot more fun with that book because I've just thrown myself into things and experimented. And it's not, a couple of chapters are very sciencey and get you lots of information, but lots of it is just, look, you are looking in the opposite direction. What are you going to do next? And one of the great things I read while researching this book was this woman called Aviva Wittenberg Cox, who talks about the 4 quarters of life, because of course we're all going to live to 83 and quite soon we'll be living to 93. And the idea that, we just shut down after 50 and go away and, sit and look at our pensions, just not going to happen. And her idea is the first quarter of life up until 25 is the time when you grow. The second quarter, 25 to 50, is when you achieve. So you make a career, you make a family, you make a relationship, whatever it is, create a garden, anyway, you achieve. And then between 50 and 75, that is the period of becoming. So we become the people we want to be. And we've done all that official stuff that we feel like we have to do. And now we have time for ourselves and we have to think, who am I? Who am I creatively? What do I want to change in this world? What do I care about? What do I enjoy doing? How am I going to make things different? And, there's a lot of work to do in the world. And then after 75 to 100, that is the period of harvesting. Fantastic.
Harvesting all your efforts. I love it. Who is it? Who is it that wrote this? And we'll link to it in the show
Yeah,
notes.
yeah. So that's great.
Who did you mention that wrote in those 4 chapters?
She's called Aviva Wittenberg Cox, and she's a kind of professor coach in the workplace. But one of her big things is women in later life staying in work and longevity. And she's written, she writes quite the sort of books for business mostly, but I love that bit of it. And one of her books does cover the 4 quarters of life.
Yeah, I
Which is
love that.
great, isn't it?
Yeah,
Because all the things we're doing in this health area are all moving us forward into that next bit of life, happily, comfortably, confidently, knowledgeably, and
it's
we
an
deserve
exciting
it because we've
chapter.
worked hard. Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you have. It's an exciting chapter, really finding out who you are and who you're meant to be, I think.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming back on the show, and please keep us posted with everything.
Good.
Everything that you're doing. I'd love to have you back when the new book is out or
Yeah.
coming out, so we can talk about that. It sounds super fun.
Yeah.
And yeah, please share now. In the meantime, how can people connect with you, Kate?
On Menoscandal Instagram, I think, and my books, Everything You Need to Know About the Menopause and Everything You Need to Know About the Pill.
Which we also did an episode on. So we'll link to that in this episode's show notes as well. So listeners can go back and listen to the one about the pill as well. That was really, really insightful. Amazing. Thank you again. And we'll see
Thank
you
you for all
soon.
the work you're doing. Really interesting.
Awesome. Thank you, Kate.